Welcome back to ETV News and Sport. Well, what do the amendments to the lockdown regulations announced recently mean for people who have recently purchased property or signed a new rental lease? Now, residents who had been unable to move or relocate during lockdown are now able to do so. So who can move and where are they allowed to move to? Remains an unanswered question. Well, for more details, we chat to Mokgehle, Senior Associate at Adams & Adams. Donald, thank you so much for joining us on ETV News and Sport. I mean, even on the day of the 7th of May, many people were nervous about the fact that they had up until midnight to be able to move for work purposes. Now, I can imagine the anxiety of those who are trying to move to either a new property they've bought or flats. So what has been the latest update since the 7th of May?
Thank you, Ayanda. So on the 7th of May, the government issued directions allowing for the once-off movement of persons and the transportation of goods for the purposes of relocating. So in terms of these regulations, tenants who signed new lease agreements before the 30th of April are allowed to move into their new places of residence should they so require. And property owners who took transfer before the 26th of March are also allowed to move into their new places of residence should they so require.
All right. So basically, just before lockdown, if I had signed a lease or perhaps, property was transferred onto my name, now I'm able to move. But as we know, with the COVID-19 and the lockdowns, situations change. So how long is this gap? Initially, folks only had up until midnight of that day to be able to move. But from the 7th of May to when are we allowed to do these movements?
In terms of the directions issued, people are allowed to move between the 7th of May until the 7th of June 2020.
All right. And Donald, what I'd like to check for you, those who are in the midst of doing their transfers and didn't quite make it in those specific gaps where you were allowed to make movements, what happens to them then?
So unfortunately, the directions do not allow for the movement of persons for the period after the 26th of March in case of property transfers. So those individuals who are expecting registration of their transfers to take place at the present moment, they will unfortunately not allowed to relocate for purposes of acquiring their new places of residence.
All right. Well, I guess it's then up to the person to get to find out what's going to happen with their transfers, with their attorneys, and I guess the banks to almost give them a clearer picture of what could possibly happen, right?
Yeah, no, indeed. Parties, they must look at their agreements of sale, and if necessary, they must enter into further terms regarding occupation of their properties. Because if transfers were to take place now, then there won't be any movement into new premises.
All right. For those who are just moving in and, for sake of argument, they would have signed that lease before the lockdown happened, what happens to rent? Are they only supposed to pay perhaps at the end of this month, end of May, even though they should have possibly moved in April?
Well, the starting point will be the lease agreement. Parties have to go through their lease agreement and establish what happens in the event of non-performance by the one party due to circumstances beyond their control. Some lease agreements, they will indicate that performance is suspended, meaning that no rental is payable because one party, the tenant, could not move into their new place of residence. And if the lease agreement is silent on this point, then parties can obviously look at the common law, and the common law provides that in the event of supervening impossibility of performance, in this instance, it will be due to the restriction of movement regulations. Then there is a suspension of performance, meaning that the parties are not required to perform in terms of their contractual obligations due to the supervening impossibility of performance.
Donald, thank you so much for that. I think you've enlightened quite a few people here who might have been tricked even by people trying to take chances, saying, no, you have to, pay up even for that month that you weren't in there. But thank you for all that information there. That's Donald Mokgehle, Senior Associate at Adams & Adams. Right, let's continue now with some more stories happening for today. An animated video from Nigeria